So, Chair, what you're now needing to do is do one last vote, which is on the original motion with the 2 amendments incorporated. One last vote on the substantive.
Took the words out of my mouth, members. So if we can have a vote on that, please. Any against? Carried.
Okay, members. Item 1, any disclosable pecuniary interest, and I believe you've all had advice from the solicitor in respect of item 17I. Thank you, Councillor. Any other declarations of interest, members?
Are there any amendments to this motion, please? Could you circulate both the amendments, please?
A couple of minutes to read through what we've said and to see what the Conservatives are saying, and see if I can reach an agreement with the Conservatives here about their amendment at least.
According to the Child Poverty Action Group, a shocking 57% of children growing up in our wards are growing up in poverty. Like me, most of my constituents live in social housing, and while that's a sector not without its own issues, there is at least some effort to charge affordable rents, maintain homes to a decent standard, and regulate property owners. Contrast that to the private sector, where landlords set rents as high as they can get away with. Disrepair and poor maintenance are common, and there is no vetting of who can and can't rent out a property. Several wards now comprising over 40% private rented accommodation. And in those areas with the highest percentage of renters, housing issues are rife. Noise and antisocial behaviour disturb what were previously quiet residential streets. Rubbish and bin bags litter what were tidy rows of terraced houses. Whole communities have been transformed in a relatively short space of time, and rarely for the better. Take, for example, the Waverley Road area, long notorious for poor quality rented housing, crime and antisocial behaviour. At the moment, it is only large HMOs of 5 or more unrelated people which are regulated in this way. More and more landlords are taking advantage of this by restructuring shared houses into self-contained bedsits or smaller HMOs which don't require a licence. What we are proposing is that the Council consider using its powers to extend licensing requirements to include smaller HMOs and other privately rented properties. I'd like to take a moment to quote directly from the Communities and Local Government Select Committee report into privately rented housing, which was published earlier this year. That said, it is clear that local authorities have fewer resources to enforce standards in the private rented sector than they did in 2010. However, this does not fully explain the variation in enforcement levels that exist between local authorities. It is clearly the case that some local authorities have placed a higher priority on addressing low standards in the private rented sector than others have done. We believe this disparity in effective action can only be resolved through political leadership. That emphasis on political leadership, for me, is key.
In a couple of places is factually incorrect. We also thank the deputations from earlier on. So, Lord Mayor, we acknowledge there are real problems which university landlords and the council are tackling, yet many of these complaints come from tenants of housing associations fed up that their constant pleas for better homes go unheeded and unrepaired.
My amendment is on the table to ensure we have a fair deal for all, a fair deal for tenants and landlords alike, which is why I've assured that we've also put registered social housing providers in the motion. While they are not subjective to selective licensing, residents who live in these properties do have significant issues on a daily basis which are brought to our attention. I firstly want to speak about the speaker we had today with Alvin Oliver. He spoke very well. He explained the legislation our council can use. He used the term sledgehammer to crack a nut.
But the enforcement powers that already exist within the Housing Health and Rating, the Housing Fitness for Human Habitation Act, the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, to name but many more, there are already over 140 statutes affecting landlords and 400 pieces of legislation.
The original motion says, in areas with significant concentrations of privately rented housing, there tends to be higher levels of antisocial behaviour, noise and waste, pollution and crime. This point is interesting because this is key when arguing the case for selective licensing and when you talk about Section 80. When you consider we have 1,202 mandatory licensed HMOs and only 108 complaints, that equates to just shy of 9% of complaints recorded in the mandatory scheme. These complaints are generally coming from neighbours rather than tenant, so around 65% from the neighbour, 35% from the tenant. This shows that neighbours are actually very proactive in complaining to the council around various issues and knowing the legislation. So our tenants are proactive, they're using the mechanisms in place, and as Alvin Oliver noted earlier, they're using the powers that we already have. And these are key things. And as regards back to the motion, if you look at paragraph 5, sentence 2, there's a subtle change in it, and it's something I broadly agree with. It's mentioned, Councillor Hunt mentioned earlier about the previous licence scheme we had. The previous licence scheme basically hasn't continued. It's because it needed to fail, and it didn't. It didn't fail. Actually, it didn't tell us anything. The data on it was really inconclusive. And if we are going to use solid data to move forward with a mandatory licensing scheme and a selective licensing scheme, I am sure a very diligent landlord organisation such as the PDPLA will be looking at this very closely, and they will take us to court as a council. And we will be in the same position our counterparts were in Brighton when they were challenged with the sector estate. This type of licensing does not obtain rent arrears, a common cause of private tenancies in ports of vending, nor can poor property conditions be conditions of the licence. I mean, this is very evident in Portsmouth. There's 18% of people who present as homeless from the private rental sector would not benefit from selective licensing.
PCC is also a landlord and lease many buildings across the city, mainly to the voluntary sector and the community sector. Therefore, we need also to be part of this scheme and put our own house in order. People like Mop and Make are in terrible buildings.
I listened to Allan Oliver, for whom I have a very considerable respect for his judgment. He believes that selective licensing won't work. He has got a good case that where it was tried in the past, as Councillor Weems has said, we found that the good landlords had to put up the rents because they had to pay for the licensing fee. The bad landlords managed to get around it and didn't use it at all.